Welcome to Lantern Voices, a podcast by Lantern Publishing and Media. The opinions and information expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of Lantern Publishing and Media Incorporated. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in and welcome. This is Lantern Voices, a podcast by Lantern Publishing and Media. I am your host, Louisa, and today we'll talk with author Angela Crawford. This is the first episode we get to premiere right after a book is out. This is so exciting. Dr. Angela Crawford is a psychologist, and her first book with Lantern, The Vegan Transformation, came out just last week. Dr. Crawford conducted a study with vegan people to better understand the impacts of a vegan lifestyle and diet on someone's mental health. During the interview, we talked about her research, about vegan allies, and much more. This is a great episode for someone who's considering becoming a vegan or who is, as Dr. Crawford very well puts it, vet curious. As always, please stay with us until the very end for our special announcements, and I hope you enjoy today's interview. Dr. Angela Crawford, welcome to Lantern Voices. Hello, Angela. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm great. So glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much for joining us. And today we're going to talk a little bit about your book that just came out. I believe when this episode comes out, your book would have come out the same week or the week before, Vegan Transformation.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited. I'm looking forward to it.
So the first question I have for you today is, what was the spark that made you want to write a book like Vegan Transformation?
Yeah. So the vegan transformation, it's been a long path coming, really. My background is as a psychologist, and I've been a psychologist for over 25 years. And for most of that, I was working as a psychotherapist, helping people through all kinds of things, stress, trauma, all the issues of life that we humans deal with. And, I became vegetarian and then vegan later. That's been, more recent. But what happened was, I'd always had a vision for writing some kind of book. I had been a journalism major before switching to psychology, and I loved writing as a child, but I just didn't know quite what it was going to be. And as a therapist, I was just so busy with seeing clients. I really didn't have a lot of extra time or energy for writing. But when I became, first vegetarian about 18 years ago, and then made that deeper commitment to becoming vegan over 6 years ago, I knew that I had found my topic. I had thought it would probably be a book that involved interviewing people because with research background and journalism background, I loved people's stories and learning, key themes that came out of studying how people experience things. And then when I became vegan, I knew that that was going to be the topic area. I just knew it was somehow going to relate to my psychology background in veganism. And then over time, I just began to get clearer on more specifics of what that would look like. I guess a couple things helped me kind of zero in on the transformation theme. One was that I felt there were a lot of books out there on veganism and physical health and how people had transformed their health through a plant-based and or vegan lifestyle. I also knew there was a lot about the ethics and also some of the challenges we face socially and emotionally when we become vegans in a not yet vegan world. But there didn't seem to be a lot about the psychological benefits that people might experience. And I myself had I would say a mind, body, spirit transformation becoming vegan. I feel like it opened me up to so many things that I hadn't been aware of before. I had been a compassionate person, but I hadn't made this connection with farmed animals and other animals that are exploited. And it was a process to really break through my own conditioning, to extend compassion to those sentient beings and to not just do it mentally, but to really feel it in my body and know that that animals weren't commodities and didn't want to participate in those systems that had been so normalized. So that was a transformation, and it was such a strong change that it led to me going, I'm an introvert. I never had a website, and I didn't have social media. I didn't do any of that stuff, but I felt so strongly about this. Suddenly I did have social media. Suddenly I was writing a blog. Suddenly I was willing to do public speaking. I just really felt bringing together the psychology piece and the veganism was really important because I think the biggest factors that sometimes block us from, embracing this lifestyle could be psychological and social. So I felt it was a missing piece of, how does this transform us, or how is it part of a transformational journey we might already be on for other reasons? And what are the benefits psychologically, spiritually, emotionally? And yes, the challenges, and how do we deal with those? And I guess along the way too, I had been in different programs, like as a psychologist, and I was in a transformational coaching program. I was in spiritual communities. And here are people that want to change the world in a positive way, but I was often the only vegan. So I'd find myself wondering, how does this disconnect continue in communities that you would think might be quicker to embrace it, and to really see this, how we treat animals and how we're treating the planet and how that's related to our food choices and other choices. And so I think that the book might also connect for people that do have that compassion and are spiritual and do care about making a better world, but yet hadn't made this connection, this connection with what we do to animals and how that affects us and the planet and the world, really. So I wanted it to be an inviting book for those who are veg curious, as well as inspiring for those already on the vegan journey. So that's sort of my thinking.
I love the term veg curious.
Yeah. Yes.
That's very good. That makes a lot of sense. Yes. I live with roommates, and I was talking to one of my roommates about that. Like, she was mentioning she's not vegan, she's not vegetarian, and we were talking about veganism and vegetarianism. And I was telling her about everything I've been learning with the authors here at Lantern and everything that I've been learning throughout my life. And she said, "Well, can you recommend me a book that is about that?" I'm like, literally, I have all of them, like Lantern library and all that. And she's like, "No, but I wanted something that would be for somebody who is not that deep into the movement yet, somebody who is just asking the questions first." And then I recommended her a few chapters from some books that we had. But after I read yours, I was like, maybe this is the book that she was looking for. And you just said the word veg curious. I think this is very, very interesting.
Yeah. I have a lot of people in my own life that are, not vegan, not vegetarian, but some of them are curious about reading this book, and whether that'll transform them or not, I don't know, but maybe it'll open them to things, to consider how it can benefit so many different areas, including their own well-being.
Yes, I think what's different, in my opinion, about your book is that compared to others that we publish here at Lantern, is the initial approach to me sounded more like you're talking to somebody who is considering the possibility instead of people who are already looking for arguments to help convince other people.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very unique approach from the other books that we have. I want to get into your own journey about it, but before we dive deep into this, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about how was the research process for the book. Was there like particular results that stood out for you? You mentioned that you did an online research with people about veganism. So I want to know, like, do you still have that data? Is it still, do you think, applicable today? Because it's been a while. How was that
Mhm.
process?
Yeah, so in 2021, I had at that point I became vegetarian in really early 2007 and then vegan in early 2019. And so 2 years after becoming vegan, I was ready to start my research. I'd been dreaming about this book for a while. And so and I didn't have a huge network yet in the vegan community. So for me, finding people to fill out the survey, that took a while. It wasn't just automatic, but I drew on networks on social media like LinkedIn and Facebook, and then I'd gone through Main Street Vegan Academies, so I had connections through that and some other vegan groups and communities. And so it started with a survey, and I knew I wanted to follow up with interviews, but I felt like a survey was a good way to first just get a more general perspective from people. And so the survey had 11 questions, and I tried to keep it very manageable, where it might take 10 or 15 minutes to fill it out because I just felt not many people would do it if it was too long. So even 5 to 10 minutes for many people probably to complete it. And it had both, I'd say, checkbox questions where people could check off multiple items to share which items they related to, and then others that were open-ended where people could share in their own words. And the questions really geared towards things like I kind of have the questions in front of me, how long they had been vegan, whether they had a fully vegan lifestyle or just the vegan diet, just to see, how many fell in those categories. And then the type of, if there was any specific type of vegan diet that they subscribed to. A lot of people just said no, just as long as it doesn't have animals, but there was a good number that were also not only describing themselves as vegan, but also tried to be whole food plant-based as well. So, and then kind of what led to their decision to be vegan and what has influenced them to stay vegan. And then got into the questions about how has it impacted their emotional well-being, any changes in their well-being emotionally since choosing this lifestyle. And there was a whole list of things that I just drew on from basically different research I'd done and, looking at the literature and also positive psychology as well. And then in their own words, what were the most positive changes? And then there were a couple of questions that had to do with emotional challenges they might have and also social challenges they might have. And then how did they cope with those? So, and then they could, if they chose, give their email address if they were open to being contacted for an interview, or they could not, they could keep it confidential. So, and then with 75 people, I followed up with in-depth interviews to go deeper on some of those questions. And those were super inspiring. I met people from all over the world. And that was probably my favorite part of the whole process, just being able to talk to different vegans, in Australia and India and just different places, obviously the US as well. And just so many of the stories and experiences just really uplifted me and made me just feel so much part of this global community. So that was my favorite part. And yeah, I just really enjoyed that.
Did you notice any cultural differences between people from different countries?
There probably were, but nothing immediately jumps out at me because it just seems that there was this common commitment. I can't imagine that many things I would reach out to people to talk about where I'd get this warm response no matter where someone was from. I think there's something about this commitment to animals and veganism that while there might have been differences, there's nothing I can point to directly. Just really amazing and just deeply, deeply inspiring. And, you were asking if anything, I think, had surprised me about the results.
Mhm.
One thing that I hadn't really expected was that this theme of interconnectedness came up with a lot of people. I hadn't thought to ask that on the checklist of, things that people might experience. I did ask about spiritual deepening and spiritual growth, and some people check that off. But I was surprised by the number of people that in their open-ended responses would say, like, I now realize I'm interconnected with all life. Like this unity with animals, nature, other beings, and, humans too, just this interconnectedness of all nature that people found. And not everybody experienced that, but that was a surprising thing that I hadn't thought to ask about, but came through. And that ended up being one of the chapters, was really zeroing in on that sense of interconnectedness and unity of realizing, I think when we're not eating animals, suddenly we can open up to how we're so connected to them and then see how that's also connected to the web of nature and life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but I understand that wouldn't be the first thing I would think about it either.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that it came from an open-ended question, so people felt like the initiative to put it out there.
Yes, exactly. And it came, when I later went back and coded the open-ended questions to see what kind of categories they seem to fall into. And that was just one that it came up a lot, surprisingly.
Lantern Publishing and Media is devoted to sharing messages of compassion. Our books inspire a better world by telling the stories of animal rights activists, climate activists, and their fights for a world where everyone can live in harmony, no matter their species. Lantern is a 501c non-for-profit organization. Your donation helps us keep our work going. If you can, go to lanternpm.org/donate to help us with any amount. Once again, the website is lanternpm.org/donate. Your generous gift enables you to support our collective mission to inform, inspire, and educate. Thank you very much. Going back to your personal journey a little bit, you mentioned in the book watching a PBS documentary on work conditions on slaughterhouses and how important it was for your vegan awakening. What do you think touched you so deeply in order to kickstart your vegan journey?
Well, it's really interesting. I think now in retrospect, there were probably some priming experiences that made watching this particular news segment so compelling for me. My husband, then boyfriend, was with me and he doesn't remember it even. So it definitely stood out for me in a way it didn't for him. But basically, we were just watching some news program on PBS, and this segment came on where they were interviewing workers in a meat processing plant, I believe, in North Carolina. And they didn't show any details really. Like, it's not like I saw the slaughter process. It didn't even really connect, like meat processing, slaughter. It didn't fully connect for me. It was just showing that the working conditions were really horrible. The workers were expected to continue working even if they were injured or they might lose their job. I think part of why that impacted me, could have been a couple of things. One is that I was working as a psychologist in a pain management program with injured workers. And so it wasn't that kind of work, but I just knew how work injuries could upend someone's life. And then if your employer is treating you horribly in the process, how traumatizing that can be. And I had also not that long ago eaten at a conference center where they serve plant-based meals, and they were really delicious. And I remember thinking at the time, like, oh, well, someone cooked for me. I think I could eat this way. Now I understand more like what vegetarians or vegans would eat. It's not such a mystery. I think I could do it, but I still couldn't imagine cooking. But when I saw this special or this program, and it just it got me thinking more about how my food got to me for the first time, and just something was ripe for me to be moved by that. And as I thought about the workers, it didn't take long for me to think, well, if you don't like how the workers are treated, what do you think about what happens to the animals? And, I just knew it was the start of this journey of exploring that. And so the very next day, I bought a cookbook, a plant-based vegetarian cookbook. I made a lasagna. It was really good. And it just different revelations. Like, I realized I had never liked handling meat, but I grew up in the Midwest. I thought I had to, eat meat. So, in fact, I probably had it at most meals. I just thought it was required for my health. And suddenly I was questioning that. I'd had those delicious meals at the conference center. And now, after I made this recipe and realized how beautiful the colors of the vegetables were and how I enjoyed it, it was creative. I'd never liked to cook. And suddenly it was an adventure. So I at the time, this was back like 2006, 2007, I started looking at all the books in my library and reading everything I could about vegetarianism and veganism, the ethics, the health. There wasn't as much yet about the environment, but some on that. And it just all the different arguments for going vegan. I didn't immediately go vegan, but I started with vegetarian. That was what I felt at the time I could do. And but even then, I still knew that the egg industry and the dairy industry was not kind either or healthy. And so I had really tried to limit that. But yeah, I think just something got me thinking and out of my old way of viewing food and realizing there's this whole process by which it gets to me, and being willing to look at that and to realize I didn't want to participate in that industry anymore. I just some part of me just said no more. And it's interesting how freeing it felt actually. Like, it seems funny, but just like realizing I don't have to eat this was freeing. I didn't have to participate in something that actually really never probably felt good, but I had believed, I didn't have a choice.
Yeah, I think some people, of course, they're gonna get to the when they learn about the atrocities and everything
Mhm.
done to the animals, or when they see some graphic images that will impact them. But I've heard stories that people didn't necessarily see the cruelty with the animals, but that message also went through them. I see people, there's this guy on Instagram who plays music to cows. And there are a lot of people getting moved by that because they see the cows. In my case, it was a middle grade book that actually got me thinking. And it wasn't about veganism, it was about dragons. So absolutely nothing to do with the fact. And the sparks are out there, and probably because I mean, maybe we're not comfortable with eating animals in the first place. So that's why it doesn't take something astronomical and out of order. It just takes the right message to get you at the right time.
Yes, very true. And I will add that, when I finally was ready to become vegan, which was several years later, I think some inner growth, some inner work on just that I needed to honor my truth. I then did seek out a lot more of those images at that time because I felt like there was something blocking me from taking that next step to I'm vegan now. I'm not eating any dairy products or, any animal products. I'm not buying any animal products. There was just something where it just felt easier to go with the flow rather than to make that shift for some reason. And so I had to then look at those images. That's when I watched Earthlings and when I read the book Slaughterhouse and read you know, the experiences of slaughterhouse workers and what happened to the animals in more depth and saw some of the images. And after Earthlings, it was just like, I just couldn't. And then I knew, like, it doesn't matter what inconvenience or whatever I think is going to happen. I can't participate in this anymore in any way. So there was a place for me for that final commitment to see those images.
I think Melanie Joy mentions that on her book with Lantern, How Doing Injustice Everywhere. And I read that you mentioned in a chapter in your book too, something like talking about carnism and mention about the dissonance there is between consuming animals but liking animals at the same time. So maybe when you see those images, you kind of helps you align with
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, it really brings it more fully into consciousness, this conflict that you're describing. Yes.
Since we're talking about your journey into first vegetarianism, then veganism, my next question is about how it was gradual. So for me, it is still gradual. So I've been saying that I think people who are, if anybody have been listening to this podcast since episode one, they've been keeping up because I always mention, I'm like, okay, I'm struggling with this, or I had that, and then now lately the last few episodes, I'm like, the bad days are little and the good days are the most. So I'm getting there. Why do you think that this gradual change is important for at least for a part of a person's journey? Do you think there's something about people needing this gradual change and not changing overnight? Or do you think there's some people that are able to change overnight?
Yeah. Well, definitely there are some who change overnight. I know people that have, and some of the people I interviewed, that was their experience. Would imagine for most people that change overnight that sort of as my experience was that there were still seeds planted before that, that maybe they weren't even aware of that, would have
Hmm.
made them ready to do it in that overnight sort of way. But sometimes we don't even recognize those seeds. Sometimes they're so unconscious or so small even that we might even not know that those even happened. But for the rest of us, it is still a more gradual process. And I would say, one, having worked with people as a psychologist and through other kinds of changes, change in general is often a process where we go through, there's, for example, a stages of change model where we go through pre-contemplation where we're not even thinking of making a change to contemplation where we're sort of thinking about it but still ambivalent to preparation where now we're ready to make a change and we're doing all we need to actually act on that change to then action and then maintenance, because just because we've made a change doesn't mean that it's going to stick. And so maintenance is another phase of the whole change process where we learn how to sustain a change over time and overcome obstacles and even work through possible setbacks and relapses that may happen and not have those, interfere with our process. So that is, normal for change to go through these phases and for there even to be setbacks. And then when you add in that we're shifting to veganism where we're maybe 3% of the global population, it adds in additional challenges in the change process that you're having to go against what maybe most likely the majority of people around you are doing in terms of daily eating. And eating is such a social thing that can be hard for people, that for a lot of us, Some people find it really easy. Like, I don't care what anybody thinks, I'm just doing what I want, but that's not everybody. So sometimes we judge other people that maybe don't make the change as quickly as some of us did. And, but the reality is we're social creatures. And for many people that, going against the status quo and the norm can be difficult. So I think that, it is normal for it to be a process. And for some people, it will be less of one and they'll just do it quickly because maybe something really hits them strongly. But if it is a process, just to keep moving forward, to not like give up. For example, when I became vegan, I set a time frame. I decided I was going to do this, but I gave myself a month to work through some of the different obstacles that I anticipated for those final changes that I needed to make. How to handle certain family situations where I found it difficult, how to handle certain meals where I still was eating some, dairy or whatever. What was I going to replace dairy or eggs with for those types of things? How was I going to handle just certain practical or social situations? So sometimes just having a plan to move towards it, but having a time frame, that preparation, I guess you'd call it, that's an important stage because we're less likely to slip backwards if we actually put into place supports and habits and our environment so that it's easier to move forward. Now, again, some people just have an overnight thing that you mentioned where it's just so dramatic. It's like they can't, it's just, there's no turning back. But again, that's not everybody's experience. Sometimes they need to work their way into it.
When I became a vegetarian, I was one of the people that would say, "Oh, it happened overnight." Like I woke up, I told my mom, I was 13. I told my mom, "I'm not doing this anymore. Bye." And then the next meal we had already didn't have any meat. I was like, "Oh, this was overnight." But now you're saying this, and I've been noticing when I'm thinking, especially now going into veganism, I was like, no, the seeds were there, because I was already doing like meatless week, and then I would do meatless Wednesdays because it was the day that I would spend the entire day in school, so I could control better what I was eating. I didn't have to like justify my choices to parents or anything. And I've been doing that for like 2 years before I became fully vegetarian. So it's like, oh, the seeds were there. You're correct.
Hi there, I'm Hope Bohannick, host of the Hope for the Animals podcast, sponsored by Compassionate Living. Join me on a journey to uncover the heartbreaking and heartwarming aspects of living vegan. My guests cover a variety of issues, but I like to focus on ethics, chickens and sanctuaries, the environment, anti-oppression activism, and the reasons for living vegan. If this sounds good to you, come check out the Hope for the Animals podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Because we're talking about the social impacts of food and how food is something very sociable, I want to talk about the chapter Thriving Emotionally and Socially with a Vegan Lifestyle. That chapter was very important to me. I think one of the most difficult aspects of becoming vegan is navigating being with loved ones and with people that are not, and that you want to hang out, or you don't want to be, especially in Latin American culture. That's where I'm from. You don't want to like be bad to your elders, and if they cook for you, you don't want them to feel bad because you're not eating their food. So I've been lucky very so far with my loved ones, my family and friends. They always include me. However, I also been in situations and it's like it's okay to bully the vegetarian. It's okay to bully because you don't do that. You give a lot of advice and very good advice in that chapter, and wanted to start like applying to my life. Do you think there was any of that advice in the chapter that was or is harder for you to follow?
Definitely. So, yeah, I talk about different ways of shifting our mindset and building supports that help us. And at the same time, one of the things I mentioned is assertive communication and healthy communication as a way to speak up in social situations and to navigate these social situations. And I think probably that one is one of the ones that's hardest for me. Just to give a little context, so I talk in that chapter about a number of things like connecting with your why, so that if your motivations for change, so that when you do run into troubles, you remember why you're doing this, and gaining knowledge and information, having a supportive tribe of friends or connections who share your journeys. So all those things are important. and learning self-care and how to manage kind of the emotions of all this. So I get into all those different topics, handling those things, but communication underlies all of it because we're having to deal with people in our meals and when we're making different decisions. And maybe now I don't want a gift from someone that has certain products in it and they might not understand why. Just even yesterday, I was at a family birthday gathering and they had a traditional cake. And even though they all know I'm vegan, I just had to explain again, well, I brought my own vegan brownie that I'm going to eat while you guys eat the cake. Why are you doing that? So it still comes up even after having been vegan this long and people knowing, and fortunately, no one was too upset about it, but these things still come up. And so communication for me has been the challenging one because even though in my profession, I would work with clients on communication on different topics, just speaking our truth, being assertive. But I think when we're triggered or feel strongly about an issue, it can be harder to get in touch with that more wise brain that knows how to communicate in the best ways. So I think we can fall into one of two things, and I've been guilty of this, of either being too passive, where maybe we don't speak up enough about what our needs and feelings and desires are, or we go to the other extreme and we do it in an aggressive way that is attacking to the other person. I tend to fall more into, I think, being too passive because middle child, empath, harmony seeker. I tend to not really want to make waves. But I have gone the other direction where I get annoyed and kind of snarky and I don't really feel very good about that either because I don't think it's really changing anyone. So I think it's finding those skills of how do we speak up about this to people? And let's put even aside the idea of trying to change someone else. Which sometimes we want to do, and that leads to its own conflicts because they may not be ready to make a change. And so if we're pushing change on them and they're not ready, that leads to conflict. But even if we're not doing that, there still can be the conflicts you described. We're eating differently than other people, and that's sort of shining a light on what they're eating, and they might give us a hard time or not understand. So I guess a few thoughts on that, that I have is one is that with my own social situations, I've tried to get better at speaking up to people ahead of time when possible, say about being vegan and that I'd be happy to bring something, just to be more proactive about these situations and less having them come up at the time because I'm not as good in the social situation and people don't always want to talk about it when they're eating. It's not always the best time to be bringing up all the details about veganism while other people are eating, even though sometimes,
Yeah, that's true.
yeah, but sometimes that happens. And I mean, it's not the end of the world, but sometimes just being more proactive, having private conversations with people about things can sometimes be helpful so that they understand more where you're coming from and why this is important to you. And then one thing I really took from Dr. Melanie Joy, and I do highly recommend her different books, including one called Beyond Beliefs, where she gets into, which I think was published by Lantern,
Mhm.
where she gets into how we communicate with those in our lives that are still eating meat. But she talks about vegan allies. And I think that's a really important concept where we're asking people that are important to us to be a support to us on our journey. And even though, yes, we'd love for them to change too, if we ask them to be our ally, they're less defensive because we're saying, this is how you can support me. This is really important to me. And then they might be more open to learning about it because you're not trying to, quote unquote, make them feel bad. You're more inviting them to be a support to you. And so I found that concept helpful because I think people are more open to supporting you if they know it's important to you. And then maybe they'll learn and be a little more open themselves along the way. But that's one thing that I've tried to work on.
That's very nice. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the meat paradox that you mentioned in your book and how it contributes to people being so reluctant in becoming vegan?
Yeah. Most of us have this value of compassion for animals. In fact, one of the surveys I think I quoted in my book was a Huffington Post poll that found that over 85% of people, regardless of whether they we're meat eaters or not, or regardless of political background, they want animals treated humanely. So the vast majority of people want humane treatment of animals. And most people have compassion for animals that comes through in just so many different ways, and the ways we spend our money, the way we treat our pets, and our companion animals. And yet, the majority of people still eat meat, which ultimately causes harm to animals and suffering and oppression. So, and exploitation. So this is this inner conflict between the idea that we care for animals and yet we still eat them and cause them harm has been called the meat paradox. And it seems like that term came out fairly close to the time, or maybe slightly after the time that Melanie Joy had written her book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, where she talks about carnism, which is that belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. So I think both really are ways of getting at this inner conflict that, and this cognitive dissonance sort of between believing one thing, that animals matter and we should have compassion for them, and yet some animals we just disregard and turn our back on and don't really think about what happens to them. And I think how that happens, Melanie Joy points to a lot of psychic defenses that we put up, different cognitive distortions of how we psychological defenses, you might say, that maybe certain animals don't matter as much, or it's we need to eat meat to be healthy, or it's always we've done it since the beginning of time. So we have all these different both personal and cultural belief systems that make us, I guess, overlook this disconnection. So yeah, it's I guess a way it's I think understanding about carnism and then learning about the meat paradox and speciesism, all these different terms, has helped me make more sense of why I was blind for so long and why so many of us who are compassionate don't just somehow don't see something that it seems like that we should be seeing or getting.
You were mentioning how private conversations might be more successful than talking about veganism at the dinner table with everybody else. And you sitting there not eating meat, even if you're quiet, you're already a little bit of a back of the head reminder that somebody over there, like somebody, something is telling me that I shouldn't do this. I see somebody who is not doing, not gonna think. So yeah, I think that that's a way for us to connect those two scenarios. Like the person that doesn't want to think about it too hard, because if they do, then they might have to change their habits.
Yes. Yes, because if I were to know this, then I'd have to change, and then I have to give up habits that maybe I'm addicted to, or that would require me to be different, or to learn or do things differently. Yeah.
They're challenging. It is challenging to become a vegan in society as we have it today. So
Yeah.
if you're going for it, you need to be able to understand that and open to jump into the challenge.
Yeah. It is. It is something like to take on. Like, I think for a lot of us, once something connects enough, it becomes one that we're really willing to take on. It even can become a joy in a way to take it on, but that still doesn't mean there aren't hard parts to it. There can be.
If you're a human being living in the 21st century, chances are that you check your email every day. Also, chances are that your inbox is constantly pretty full. We know how important it is to keep up to date with things that matter. This is why our newsletter is so amazing. We only send one newsletter a month, and within it, you'll find all our latest news and, sometimes, access to exclusive content. Recently, we went through all our contacts and did a huge cleanup, trying our best to make sure that no one is in the list multiple times and no one's going to keep getting tons of emails. We want to keep you informed without overwhelming you with 1,000 messages. We know you don't have time to waste with 100 new emails. Give your time to what really matters. Go to lanternpm.org and sign up for our newsletter today.
For us to end on a high note, just for fun, what is your favorite recipe among the ones that you share at the end of your book?
It's funny. It wasn't my first thought to have recipes in the book, but when I told my friends in my community, who were most of my local friends are not vegan, and when I told a group of friends from my church that I had gone to and other people, they're all like, well, will it have recipes? And so since it came up from so many people that like it has to have recipes, so I thought, well, I guess it does. If I want it to be for people that might be curious, then it probably does. And so since I'm not a recipe developer, I asked some of the people that I interviewed for my book that I knew did that type of stuff for them to contribute recipes. And so there's probably 25 or 30 recipes in there. And I tried them all to make sure that the recipes flowed well. And I really liked all of them, even ones that I would have thought, I'm not sure I would have made this, but wow, I really love it. They were all really good. But a couple favorites that jumped out to me. One was the tempeh and sweet potato wrap that a friend and colleague, Diana Goldman, who just published a cookbook on her own called Plants for You. That recipe was really good. And then there was also this whole enchilada recipe that I made for some non-vegan family members, and they loved it. It was really good. And that was from Amy Hamlin, the Coalition for Healthy School Food. So that was really good. There's also a peanut butter chocolate chip cookie recipe that is super healthy, but I added a little extra cocoa and a little extra chocolate chips because I'm a chocoholic. And I thought it was great. It was really good. So healthy and yummy. So
Oh, I should try that. I cannot cook very well. It's a challenge in my life, but I can bake. So I think I'll try that one.
yeah, it wasn't a hard recipe at all. It just, if you like chocolate, add a little bit more of the cocoa and chocolate chips. But yeah, it was good.
Amazing, amazing. Well, thank you very much for being here with us at Lantern Voices today. Before I let you go, is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners?
Yeah. Well, first of all, whatever opens you to explore this path, I think it's a path that it just opens up so many doors, because veganism at its heart is a philosophy of compassion for animals and living our life in compassion for animals. But even if someone enters the door because of health or because of the environment, what I found through my interviews is there's just this growing movement of vegans that are getting the interconnectedness of all of these issues. And there's something about that not only am I being kind to animals, I'm being kind to my health, I'm aligning with my values, and I'm leaving the planet in a better place and helping food security. There's something about all these things being interconnected that gives even more momentum and more meaning to. So it's just whatever makes you walk through the door, it's fine, and just keep exploring and learning, because they do find that the more reasons that we find for this path, the more likely we are to stay committed to it and keep learning and discovering how to overcome any challenges. So just keep exploring and do keep finding supports, because I think the support is key to keep moving forward and to thrive on this vegan path.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing.
I was honored to be here, and just so honored to, publish a book through Lantern. It's been a great experience.
Oh, it is a pleasure to have you as one of our authors.
Yay.
Thank you very much for your time and for everything that you shared with us here today, and for your book that is, if you're listening to this episode today, it's probably already out. You can go to lanternpm.org and you'll find the book right on the first page, all with our new releases. You can just click on vegan transformation and it will show up a lot of all the buttons that you can click to pick your favorite bookstore or book buying mode. We also have the book available on ebook. Angela, thank you once again, and I'll see you soon.
Sounds good.
Bye.
This was our interview with author Angela Crawford. If you have any comments or thoughts you'd like to share with us, please leave them in the comments section on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Or share it on Instagram and tag us at LanternPM. We would love to hear from you, especially if you're one of the listeners that has been here with us for a while. We want to know what you are enjoying, and if you have any suggestions as what we can do to make this podcast even more interesting. Don't forget that you can get any book ever featured in this podcast with 25% off at our ebook store. Go to lanternpm.org, click on ebooks, select the Vegan Transformation or any other book ever featured in the podcast, and use the coupon LanternVoices25 at checkout. The coupon is Lantern Voices, just like the podcast, and the numbers 2 and 5, all together, no spaces. This coupon is valid only for ebooks, digital books, and only at lanternpm.org. Thank you for joining us. As always, if you like the podcast, please leave a 5-star review on the platform you're listening to. This is really so helpful for us. And follow us at Lantern PM on Instagram, Lantern Publishing and Media on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. and at Lantern PM Official on TikTok. We'll be back in 2 weeks with more Lantern Voices. Goodbye!